Here with us now in the studio is Jenny Tao. She's Assistant Director of the U.S. Korea Institute at Johns Hopkins University. And joining us from Beijing is Tong Zhao. He's a Nuclear Policy Fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. And Brian Becker is a Policy Analyst on U.S DPRK relations and the Executive Director of the Answer Coalition here in Washington, D.C. Thanks all of you for joining us. Jenny, let's pick up. Ambassador Bill Richardson was saying there's 60-40% chance he gives of the summit between U.S. President Trump and Kim Jong-un. But of course, we have the ROK, the Republic of Korea, meetings first, which is going to lay the groundwork. He seems pretty optimistic. Do you share all this?
You know, I think they are all very committed to having a win. The question is what will they actually walk away with? And, you know, this isn't usually how the U.S. does diplomacy. And so it's hard to sort of imagine that they can come away with an actual agreement on something other than trying to figure out a mutual way forward. What is the path that we want? What is sort of the timing we want? But, you know, this is a summit meeting. You're not going to get into the details of what a verification regime looks like or who's going to play the different parts. I think now it's really just to set the mandate for broader negotiations that deal with those details, because the details matter, and that's really what's going to make or break an agreement.
But Kim Jong-un's announcement before the ROK talks and before the Trump talks seems to be like he's leaning forward, wanting to move very quickly. Is that your impression?
Well, he's leaning forward. He's giving away sort of the diplomatic concessions that are easy to give away. And so, you know, he hasn't said he's going to stop fissile material production. He said he's going to stop testing, which he's already said in the past. He's going to close down Punggye-ri, for instance, which, again, the way that he's framed it domestically is that we don't have to do it anymore because we've already said we've declared victory on our nuclear program. So these are the easy parts to give away, and these are the easy parts to, you know, perhaps even allow inspectors to come in and see that they're not doing work there. But, you know, when it comes to what is the fissile material production, you know, he hasn't said he's stopping the programs. He said he's stopping testing. And so that's when you get into the details of what do we know, what do we not know, and how much more do we need to know to have, you know, confidence that he is actually denuclearizing and not just showing us what we want to see.
Tong Zhao in Beijing, obviously China has welcomed the announcement over the weekend by Kim Jong-un, but Jenny's right, the devil's in the details, right?
I agree. I think if we define success by an immediate North Korean denuclearization, we are going to be disappointed because that is not in the card of the North Korean playbook. North Korea values so much about its nuclear weapons, it will not give up the crucial guarantee for its regime security and survival. But I think North Korea is willing to offer meaningful concessions on the other hand. North Korea is willing to take measures in the direction of freezing and capping its nuclear capabilities, not further advancing them. North Korea might even consider measures to scale back some of the less important nuclear and missile components of the program. For example, North Korea's submarine-launched ballistic missile program, which has received a lot of investment and has actually resulted to a number of missiles, workable missiles for North Korea. But that program is not very meaningful from the military perspective. North Korea still needs to put a lot more investment to make it work. And also, the entire environment, North Korea is facing anti-submarine warfare capabilities from the U.S., South Korea, and Japan. So it would be very unlikely that North Korean submarines would be survivable. So I think North Korea might be able to consider giving up those programs. But in either case, I think we need to be realistic and therefore work on those near-term steps.
Brian Becker, the U.S. president has tweeted over the weekend and before that DPRK have agreed to denuclearize. Now, is that just him claiming the win before it's even happened? Or is there a real chance here of a complete misunderstanding about what that means and the summit not working?
Right. He also tweeted, some people might not know that the Korean War isn't over. So Donald Trump is learning day by day basic sort of foundational information about Korea. But of course he could be not understanding the situation fully. But here's, I think, the big picture. And I think it's important to step back and look at the big picture. in a way that details, while crucially important, I agree, are secondary to this. Does the U.S. government actually want to find a new relationship with the DPRK? Because you can see from the DPRK's strategy and its tactics that it's having a synchronized, reciprocal negotiating approach. We'll do this, let's see if you'll do this back. And if you follow the path, which is a very predictable path, you could see that over time, there could be a real thaw in relations. It doesn't have to be a love fest, but there could be a real thaw. And there could be thus a change. The Korean War could come to an end. Every war has a beginning. Most wars have an end. This one hasn't had an end. Does I think Moon Jae-in wants it to come to an end.
Yes.
Kim Jong-un wants it to come to an end. Does Washington want it to come to an end? So in a way, it's about desire and it's about will from the Washington establishment. Donald Trump is getting lots of headwinds right now because there's great fear from the military-industrial complex and parts of the Pentagon and the media establishment who think that it's awful that there could be some big new stage in U.S. DPRK relations. Maybe if Obama did it, they would think it's a good thing, but under Donald Trump, it's not a good thing. So Donald Trump has a big problem, but it's really in Washington.
Well, I mean, Jenny, could you argue that any president would have to deal with this because this was the period in which the DPRK proved it could have a potential ICBM capability to hit the US. They're at maximum leverage right now, and the US obviously is pursuing this path of maximum pressure. So both nations are at a point where they almost have to negotiate.
Right. I think that's true. They do have to negotiate to deal with this issue now, so that it doesn't escalate into something that nobody wants, and that is a second Korean War. I think there is a difference, though, between Kim Jong-un saying that he's willing to talk about denuclearization, willing to commit to denuclearization, and again, what does that mean, and what does that mean to the different parties? There's a lot, as Tong Zhao said, there's a lot that can be done that are positive steps towards denuclearization without actually getting there.
So do you see, sorry to interrupt, peace treaty first? Is that the thing that creates the goodwill?
Well, so that's always the way that the North Koreans have tried to pose it in the past few years, is that in order to denuclearize, we first must stop the conflict. And the way that the U.S. And the international community in the past, and especially South Korea in past administrations, has approached it is we can't stop the war until we denuclearize. And so the fact that this government in South Korea is now willing to talk about a peace agreement, a peace treaty before denuclearization, it does change the nature of that conversation. And I think, again, it's something that in Washington we are uncomfortable with, and there is a lot of uncomfort with it because if you go down this path, does it legitimize North Korea's nuclear weapons program, or will it make progress? And those are things that we just don't know. Like, if you do the peace treaty, what other incentives are there then for North Korea along that way to continue down a path towards denuclearization?
Tong Zhao, do you agree? What needs to be guaranteed beyond a peace treaty to the DPRK for this process to work? We know that Kim Jong-un wants to, now that the nuclear deterrent is established, wants to swing towards the economy. Is that message being read loud and clear in Washington, or do you think the region, like countries like China, need to sort of explain how this could work a little bit?
To be honest, I don't think the international community at this moment has any real leverage over North Korea to force North Korea make fundamental nuclear concessions. Remember, North Korea is very smart. Kim Jong-un came to Beijing to meet with Chinese president before he goes to South Korea and to meet with U.S. president. And even if North Korean leader, I'm sure he knows that there is a big uncertainty about the results of the U.S. North Korean summit, and therefore he has repaired the North Korea-China relationship. And now, even if the U.S. North Korea summit failed, the U.S. wouldn't be able to resort to the military option because China would be strongly opposed to it, Russia would be strongly opposed to it, South Korea would be strongly opposed to it. And the U.S. wouldn't even be able to dramatically increase the economic sanctions on North Korea because China and Russia would not agree to any additional UN Security Council resolutions to impose extra sanctions on North Korea as long as North Korea refrains from conducting any additional nuclear and ICBM tests, which North Korea has already promised not to do. So without any additional economic sanctions, I don't think there's any chance that the U.S. or any other country can force North Korea to make any more nuclear concessions. So going back to the issue of peace treaty, the peace treaty was very difficult before because it requires both parties, the two main parties, North Korea and the United States, to make fundamental concessions, for North Korea to give up nuclear weapons, for the U.S. to provide irreversible security guarantee, which is very difficult to do because security guarantee by definition is reversible. And that's the very important reason why previous grand bargains with North Korea, previous efforts to make comprehensive agreements with North Korea failed. But now we have a different foundation. North Korea has already got a rudimentary nuclear deterrent capability. And that provides a new foundation for peace treaty. North Korea wouldn't give up its core nuclear weapon capabilities. But on the other hand, the U.S. and South Korea also wouldn't need to provide something that they cannot provide, which is irreversible security guarantee. So I think they are likely to reach a new peace treaty in which they basically make a political commitment to the principle of non-aggression and not to threaten each other, to end historical hostility. But I think that would not be a denuclearization agreement, but it's still important for improving relations and to avoid a major military conflict in the region.
Brian, sorry, Jenny, you wanted to say. I was just saying that Tong Zhao came up with an important point there. It was that after this summit, if it does happen between Trump and Kim Jong-un, the ball goes back into the international community's court. He looks like he's willing to negotiate. If the US back off, the raison d'etre of the maximum pressure campaign kind of falls apart, doesn't it? This is a problem.
Yeah, and I was just going to, reiterate what he just said in terms of, when you're talking about security guarantees, when you're talking about North Korea, their experience with the international communities, their experience with the United States, for instance, it's not enough to just say it. And this is why their concept, North Korea's concept of denuclearization is a much longer process, because in that you have to build trust and you have to build confidence. You can't just say on paper, oh, we're not going to attack you, because again, they've seen things kind of come and go. They've seen agreements broken. They've seen things fall apart. And so it's not enough to the words. You have to actually build up the political track record as well in order to actually build up confidence in that sort of guarantee.
Brian, there's also, you hear this out of Tokyo a lot, where there's this fear here that what might be happening is an attempt and a potential for the alliance structure in Northeast Asia to fall apart. You have a US president who wants to make history, who's worried about the ICBM threat on the US homeland, and yet may do a bargain where somehow a deterrent is kept by the DPRK, where they have short-range nuclear missiles or some capability to hit Japan and the ROK. This is a nightmare scenario for Tokyo and potentially for Seoul. Do you see that as a problem going forward?
Well, it's a problem mainly for the Japanese political establishment. The U.S. treats Japan as a junior partner. They are, in fact, functioning as a junior partner.
Abe's visit was...
Yeah, and thus Japan doesn't really have a veto here. Also, let's go back, and again, North Korea was totally annihilated by the United States between 1950 and 1953. The main complaint of American pilots was there's nothing left to bomb, and that was by December.
More bombs than anywhere before, yeah.
Yeah, by December 1950. So the country's been completely annihilated. It looked at Libya, it looked at Iraq, where governments gave up weapons of mass destruction, and then not only were bombed and occupied, but their leaders put to death. I mean, this can't be lost. And also the DPRK is looking at the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the Iran nuclear arms deal, where the U.S. appears 2 years after negotiating a deal, a complex agreement, to be reneging on it. So, of course, the DPRK isn't looking at American policy through rose-colored glasses. They're not idealists by any means. But I do think, as the other guests have mentioned, DPRK emerges from this in a stronger position. They are the ones that seem to be yearning for an agreement. And so if someone else stops it, those people, that force will become isolated on the international scale. Maybe not completely isolated, but it will enhance American isolation if the U.S. goes forward like that.
I'm glad you mentioned the Iran deal, because May the 12th is the deadline, or the next deadline, when the US could pull out, and all signals are they very will do. Tong Zhao, in that context, and given the fact that we have an administration that's led by US President Donald Trump, but we have people like John Bolton as the new National Security Advisor, Mike Pompeo could very much be Secretary of State there, both of whom have talked about regime change in the DPRK, or at least the negotiation will be very short because give us your missiles, we'll take them, and then we might think about doing something. Given that those advisors being so close to the president, do you see problems ahead in terms of even talking on the same page?
Well, I do believe if the U.S. scraps Iran deal, that would have very negative impact for the regional security in Middle East. But I think its impact on the upcoming North Korean nuclear negotiation is going to be limited because the premises for the two cases are different. I don't see a deal in which the U.S. and North Korea are going to make fundamental agreements on North Korea's nuclear issues. In other words, North Korea is not prepared to give up its nuclear weapons in return for a security guarantee. The premise for this negotiation is going to be North Korea gets to keep the core of its nuclear weapons, and in return, the U.S. and others would promise to improve relations, reduce tensions, hostilities, etc. So it does not require North Korea to trust the credibility of the U.S. government. So the impact on this negotiation is going to be limited. But going back to the core senior U.S. officials in the White House, I think actually their position can be flexible. Of course, they want to achieve something bigger. They want to achieve immediate denuclearization. They want to do it in a one-shot approach. However, if we read the testimony of Mike Pompeo, just days after he came back from Pyongyang and met with North Korean leader Kim Jong-un, he said at Congress that it is unimaginable to have a comprehensive deal with North Korea at this moment. And therefore, he wants to start a process. Right. And in the long run, this process might lead to the goal that we want to achieve. So based on his statements, I think there is this room for being flexible, even among the most hawkish U.S. senior officials.
Tong Zhao, thanks. Jenny, because that's important, because the fear is these talks could collapse and then the military option becomes very much the only option left for the U.S., considering their rhetoric and the corner they painted into. Do you see a problem with that, or do you share, actually, Tong Zhao's optimism? It's good to hear optimism from Beijing. I think this is good.
Well, I agree with the fact that I do think, if the Iran deal falls apart, it's going to have a limited effect on North Korea in terms of negotiating a new deal, because they've already had an agreement fall apart. It was the agreed framework. And one of the key actors in that falling apart was John Bolton. So it is interesting now that he's back in the White House. And I think, certainly the North Koreans will consider that in that process. But they also know the elections, the presidential cycles are only so long. They also know the presidential cycles in South Korea are only so long. And so there's a lot that can be done. There is incentive for them to move down a path in order to gain economic, economic development in that process. But certainly they are always going to be cautious, and that's why it needs to be a process. It can't just be, expecting North Korea to come in and put their nukes on the table.
Brian, last word, 30 seconds.
Well, if anybody looked at North Korea carefully the last few years, you can see that the North Korean government has had a priority on economic development. There's been lots of production, lots of construction. This is not something new. They even adopted a nuclear program because it would be cheaper than conventional military. This is a big priority for Kim Jong-un's government. Great.
Brian Becker, Jenny Town, Tong Zhao, great to have you on. Really intelligent discussion. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Nathan King in Washington, D.C. Thanks so much for watching.